sometimes along the strenuous, harsh and punishing path that is of a 21st century young man trying to find a show actually worth his so very cheap and so easily distractible attention, you happen to be slapped in the face with something actually real. I happen to experience the thing that used to be described by my younger, non-adult self as emotions. Ah, such fond memories I have of those things. Beef brands itself as dark comedy, and it is. The same way those very delectable times when you end up going through situations so absurdly cruel that it feels like the universe is playing a joke on you and you can't help but laugh at yourself could be described as comedy. And in order to describe what makes beef slap, I'd like to build up from the start until we address the meat of the matter. Got it? Because beef is actually meat and it's the name of... The show starts by putting Amy and Danny in a situation where the culmination of their respective frustrations with their own lives makes them take it out on each other and trigger one another in such a way that they become intertwined. Hence the name of the show. It's all about their beef, and the beef is the tool they both use for escapism. Although this is kind of the whole premise of the show, where both get to finally be their unhinged, ugly selves in the most hilarious fashion, make no mistake, this is only but a ploy for something else. The show is flirtatiously trying to fuck you, and you're gonna let it do so, because it's so good at it. So, what do I mean by that? Let's first try by taking apart our two main characters. Danny staked his entire self into having a successful business. Danny the hustler. That's how he'd describe himself.
I've been hustling my whole life. You know?
But underneath that, his struggle was a symptom of something else. Danny's entire self-worth is a consequence of what he can do for everyone around him. For his parents and his brother, his entire perceived felt value is in direct correlation to how helpful and valuable he is to the people he loves, and his failure to do so continuously throughout his life drained him to the point of him trying to end his own life, using barbecue grills. But since he's so committed to his streak of failures, he fails at that as well, and ironically, his unwillingness to derive his own self-worth from his own life.
Just live. I am living.
His unwillingness to not want to help himself, to not want to be selfish the right way, made his loved ones suffer even more than they should have, by making empty promises to his parents and imprisoning his own brother. He ended up causing more harm than if he hadn't done anything in the first place. And although Danny's actions from a shallow outside perspective could be assumed to be an act of selflessness, Danny's actions come from a very selfish intent.
It's hard. It's not easy.
Danny is terrified of being alone, and so he does everything in his power to keep his family as close to him as possible. And the way he does that is by trying to make them need him and rely on him, make himself indispensable to them. He constantly lies to his brother and manipulates him, with little to no guilt to show for it. Danny's intentions were made crystal clear when we were made aware of the extent he's willing to go to not let his brother leave by throwing away his college letters applications.
Do you really think it's possible to love someone unconditionally?
The reason why Amy married her husband is because he didn't have any of the parts she hated in herself. He was, by her own standards, a good person, making her in contrast inherently a bad and ugly person. What she didn't know though is that by choosing George she condemned herself into a lifetime of isolation, since George never sees her, which she tries to remedy by attempting to bridge the gap with vulnerability and openness. But George is so far off from who Amy is that it was bound to fail from the start.
But sometimes it feels like if I tell you things, you're not gonna understand.
He never had the capacity to see her, and she made sure of that. She also projects this exterior of the happy, successful woman who has it all, while her soul is slowly drained out of her in order to maintain that image. The gap between who she is and who she projects is filled by the equivalent amount of suffocating suffering. As a consequence of these two choices, Amy's life became as much a prison as she could possibly muster to make it. This was hinted on all throughout the show. She always seems like she's gonna turn into a small-grade nuke, blowing everyone in her vicinity into dust every time she's bombarded with the whole positivity shtick. This basically happens whenever she's put in a position where her authentic reaction is so far off from what her character is allowed to do that you can physically see the pain it inflicts on her to suppress herself. Her house was also a hint to this by Ali Wong's own admission. They designed the house in such a way that it would look like a prison. Amy's actions can be boiled down to one single belief. Her strongest, deepest belief is that she is unlovable, that if anyone ever truly saw who she was, they would get repulsed by her. And so, she hid herself from everyone. She created a persona that she deemed acceptable for every person she ever encountered, and she kept the act for her entire life. She made sure no one could ever see her, and by doing so, condemned herself into never being loved by anyone.
There's this feeling I've had for a long time. It never goes away.
The whole setup of the show serves one singular goal: to explore the struggle of being a person in its real and raw nature, which entails not being able to accept ourselves, not being able to accept reality, and the hefty price we pay in trying to maintain our illusions alive. By rejecting ourselves, we reject the world, and by rejecting the world, we reject ourselves. Beef is about the struggle of being a human being. It is about self-worth and the shame we feel about ourselves. It is about the 50 layers of coping mechanisms we bury our true selves under. It's about the constant lies we tell ourselves to stomach reality. It's about our failures and our powerlessness trying to handle life. It's about feeling unlovable by anyone who could ever truly see who we really are deep down. It's about being driven by emotions of lack our whole lives without realizing it. It's about spending a lifetime trying to pursue something to fix a feeling we've always unknowingly carried. It's about our nature that is inherently accompanied with ugliness, our rejection of this truth, and the struggle that paradox entails. Beef is about how our beliefs about ourselves and about the world can shape our life in the most horrific fashion and sometimes make us the maker of our own miseries, the builder of our own prisons, and all that without ever being aware of ourselves. How our fears are a lot of the time in the driver's seat of our lives. But when you compare both our characters' struggles, they seem quite far apart and different. The only thing they seem to obviously have in common is how broken and committed to being miserable they both are. And that's pretty much it. But the show was hinting to a deeper connection between them, which was portrayed in the scene under the tree, where both kind of melt and become one another by taking each other's place. The entire show was a build-up to that moment. So clearly it's not just a ploy, but very much something we were supposed to be looking up to. This leads us to the core message of the show. Amy and Danny get to become one another because they are one another, because they are both manifestations of the same thing.
We're just a snake eating its own tail.
The desire to be loved, to not be alone. That is what they are. And that is what you and I are as well. Every person has a Danny and an Amy in them. That's why this show hits so hard. That's why it feels so real. Because we're not just seeing two characters going through shit. We're seeing ourselves. We're seeing the people we know. Where we ought to be scraped down to our deepest core. The same truth grounded in the reality remains. Underneath it all lays the truth of our oneness. The need to be loved. The need to not be alone. That is what we are. We just happen to be born and have different bodies.
If God is everything, then we're God.
God's just trying not to feel alone in nothingness.